How about now, Arthur D? Am I still muted? Thanks for thanks for that. My volume levels are hopefully good now. Okay. Yes. Am I currently on mute now? I pressed the button on my thing. Celeste Girl let me know there was no audio before. Hopefully it's going now. The Blue Yeti has a little mute button. I didn't realize it had been clicked. So I'm talking and interacting, and here's hoping that now... Oh, thanks, Arthur. I was saying that I put together a video yesterday talking about the fact that, well, it was a rough couple of weeks for me. I just hadn't been producing the content that I wanted to, and every time I started thinking about prison and what story I was going to tell next, well, I didn't make it much further than thinking about prison, I guess. I suppose it's forgivable. You spend enough years in a pretty crummy environment, and there's the impulse to forget about it, to lock it out. I recall in Dante's Inferno, it was written, whenever you entered hell, abandon all hope, ye who enter here. And whenever you exited, it said something along the lines of, ye who leave, don't forget the things you've seen. Not that California prisons are any approximation of hell. If we're being honest, the quality of life was pretty good most days. But there's that human impulse to, whenever you leave something nasty, to block it out and forget that it was real and pretend that there's no way you could go back. A common effect of this is that whenever people parole, they'll tell their cellie or their friend that they've known for years, don't worry, man, I'm going to write you. You'll hear from me. I'll visit, I'll call. Things are going to be all right for you, cellie, because I'm going to get out and I'm not going to forget about you even though you got life. And then the guy never hears from you. This is a common occurrence. It's kind of a cliche in prison that if somebody promises that they're going to write you whenever they get out, well, they won't. It's not always the case. Some guys, too. I've corresponded with one or two friends that I made while incarcerated. But by and large, what you do is you pretend like you weren't there. Sad F is the prison that I'm going to be talking about. In the near future, I want to continue the story of the professor and this general time period of my doing time. There were a lot of interesting things about this little chunk where I've spoken about the professor, and he was a pretty nasty guy, but he was so well put together, so professional. I would have assumed that he was a white-collar criminal who had gotten caught embezzling or something like that and came to prison. I was a clerk in the office at this time. And the gentleman whom I trained to replace me, though if we're being honest, saying that I trained him is such a small sentence because he walked into the office knowing as much about computers as I did, if not a lot more. It took about an afternoon of explaining, here's the little contingencies, the little things you need to know about being a clerk here on E-Yard, before he was perfectly qualified to do the job himself. He was another very well put together guy. Called him Sonar. He was clever, smart, and he actually was in on some kind of white-collar crime. There's the possibility it had a negative aspect to it because he didn't want to talk about it. He never told me exactly what he was in for. But I do know that whenever he arrived at the institution, he had a note in his file that he wasn't allowed to access computers. There was a 128B informational chrono saying that he should never be given access to computers while incarcerated. Whatever he'd done had some kind of digital element to it. However, because he was qualified to do the job, the lieutenant for whom I worked actually got into the file and talked to a counselor and had it discreetly removed, so that he was able to hire the guy and I was able to train him. Sonar was a decent guy, by and large. He was funny, clever, and he was well acquainted with the professor. The two of them were friends, I suppose. Friend is a strange word in prison, but they hung out whenever they could. They'd walk laps on the yard, eat lunch, and whatnot. I suppose they say birds of a feather flock together, and it makes sense whenever you're quiet, intelligent, you like computers, you don't have a real interest in drugs. And I'm not saying that neither of these guys ever did drugs, but there's about a quarter, maybe a third of the inmate body who they don't care like everybody else does. Whenever the drugs hit the yard, you got about a half of the guys, maybe even more, really concerned about it. They want to get them some of that dope, whatever it is. And then you have the rest of the guys that care about gang stuff, criminal stuff. They're standard criminals. Your other third or a quarter of the yard, guys like the professor, Sonar, I suppose myself, to a lesser degree, they can end up blending in a strange way because they're not involved in the everyday drama. I know Sonar, he had a cell. Some guys live in dorms out in the public, and some guys live in cells where they have a door they close. And if Sonar wasn't at work or walking laps with the professor, I know where he was. He was at home with the door closed. And that's 12, 14, 16 hours on a standard day that he's not interacting with the rest of the inmate body. Breakfast, dinner, and work were the only times you really saw him out. I suppose that's a clever way to do your time if you can avoid staying out the mix, is what they call it, not being involved in the everyday drama, whether Frank is going to stab Tony, or bear in mind, this was an SNY yard with a very high transgender ratio. So in fact, while there was some drama about whether or not this gang was going to fight with that gang, a lot of the drama was related to people's relationships. Yes, Frank might stab Tony, but it's a quarrel because Tony happens to be dating Timmy, and, Timmy has betrayed Frank. I saw a lot of fights, even melees, not full-on riots, but 2-on-3, 2-on-2, this type of thing, which were essentially domestic disputes, perhaps even lovers' quarrels. I recall one occasion, which was really very sad, where there were a pair of guys. There was a guy and a transgendered female. And I don't recall the name of the girl, but the guy was called Mike. And I don't know what happened between them. It's not like I was at all involved in their lives. The only reason I had any information about them is because Mike was my neighbor. But they had a fight. And I don't mean they yelled at each other. I don't mean perhaps even they pushed each other. I mean that it was somewhere near the officer's station, and I saw Mike come around and fully punch his girlfriend in the face and put her on the ground. Of course, you do have to bear in mind that this is prison, and whatever testosterone blockers you might take, this is still a 250-pound biological male. There are aspects of combat which have to do with how your bones are built, how much weight you have, that have nothing to do with how you identify for gender. And this was a real fight. Mike's girlfriend came up and came back in and solid right back at Mike, and there were only about 2 or 3 blows shot back and forth before they disengaged and the cops came in. But there was a sad moment where I saw Mike, he was crying to himself. And then I looked over and his girlfriend had... I don't know what initiated the quarrel to that point, and they were separated after that. I don't expect they ever spoke to each other again. But it speaks to the way that people can get so involved in their everyday lives. Well, Sonar had the right idea. He didn't have a girlfriend or a boyfriend. I don't know if he even had friends besides the professor, and really they only hung out for a couple hours a week at most. Sonar hung out in his room all day. The reason I brought up Sonar is because he did something that I was almost involved in. There is a system in CDC whereby they keep track of every inmate, where they are, where they're going, which of course they would need to have. Sonar was involved in building the system. He was hired as a contractor within CDC. They actually gave him a chrono saying that he was going to be working to set this up. And all he really did that I saw was that there were a bunch of old printed paper forms. And he scanned them onto the computer and then very carefully went in and provided fields for the forms to work. So that where before you'd had, say, a 128 where there was a bunch of information that needed to be filled in. The inmate's name, what cell he was in, what date he was arrested, what his parole date was, whatever information you might need. And so he got into Microsoft Word after having scanned the document and created small fields which could be filled in, and this information would be carried over to an Excel spreadsheet so that they could keep track of where the inmates were, put all their information in just a little bit more efficiently. I had very little interest in finding a way to make the administration work more efficiently, helping them keep track of inmates. I'm not sure that that's something that I was happy to be involved in if I could have. Essentially, you're helping keep yourself locked up, and if you're not satisfied with the system and you help to prop it up, to some degree, you're morally culpable. You are a part of the system. But it was such an interesting procedure that he was involved in, where they were taking all of this old paperwork. And I'm sure there was somebody else that was doing data entry. They were just looking at form after form and typing the stuff that was on the paper form and putting it into the computer form. But the actual job of creating the computer forms with the fields that would auto-update by carrying the information over to a spreadsheet and then sending that to the counselor and the lieutenant and the warden and all that, it was a pretty neat job for anybody to be involved in as an inmate within CDC. It feels like if somebody had been particularly clever and had thought it through, there was perhaps some mischief that he could have gotten involved in. He didn't. He was a professional and acted professionally, but CDC is constantly in this situation where they have to give some authority, some power, as it were, to inmates that they house. And the question is, how much can you give before they'll take advantage of it? What about trustees? Trustee is an inmate who is given some nominal position of trust. Perhaps he has a key because he needs to be able to open up this little box where they keep his supplies. Perhaps his job is to go around and make a list of all of the inmates who are supposed to be allowed to go to the canteen that day and give it to the canteen worker. Well, any job like this, you can take a key and turn it into another key. You can take a list and add people's names to it or take names away from it. You have power, authority. The administration has to constantly assess how much power and authority they can give to an inmate lest it be abused. There is in the CCR, the California Code of Regulations, which is all of the rules that administrations within the government will use in California. There is a rule that says that inmates may not have authority over other inmates, regardless of how trusted of a member of the clerks or porters or whatever job you have, regardless of how trusted of a member you are, even if the warden says, well, that inmate there, I trust him. Stupid warden to say something like that, but imagining he did. Legally, they still can't give that inmate authority over other inmates. No matter how deeply I had brown-nosed with the warden or whose butt I had kissed to prove that I was the best, most important inmate in the world and that I should get all the authority I want, I'm still legally prohibited from doing things like writing up other inmates, from deciding whether or not they'll be allowed to participate in programs. Authority is a general word. But the idea is that inmates are second-class citizens within CDC. They can't make decisions about whatever other inmates might be allowed to do, how they should be treated, because if they do, they'll abuse that authority. You'll end up with a gang of trustees. And this did happen in a lot of old school prisons. You go back to the 60s, 70s, 80s, the laws were a little different, and there were actually small groups of inmates that ran the prison behind the scenes. The Hells Angels were notorious for having clerk positions and things like that. And a lot of times, if you needed to get something done, say you wanted to get a family visit scheduled, say you wanted to get transferred to an institution and you needed the paperwork processed properly, you didn't go to your counselor, you didn't go to a cop, you went to a gang. And you asked, hey, what's the bribe for this? There's a carton of cigarettes, get me a family visit this weekend? The system has changed since. It's far more formal, far more structured. But I talked to a lot of guys who had done time in the 70s and the 80s, And they said that it was a free-for-all, and that if you had money, if you knew the right guy, well, prison was a cakewalk. You had anything you wanted except getting out of prison, which I suppose is what people actually wanted. Well, I'm trying to figure out how long I've been on. I don't see the thing. Oh, 15 minutes. There we are. I looked down at my screen to check and make sure that I didn't have any comments. As always, I'm happy to talk about any specific aspect of prison life that anybody's interested in. I most recently talked about the fear of relapse and recidivism, and how difficult it is for a lot of inmates to get out of prison and not go back to the drugs. Oh, those drugs will crawl into your head, and whenever you're under pressure, whenever you're stressed, they'll remind you in this quiet, insidious voice. Just a hit of whatever your drug of preference might be, and you'll feel so much better. And it's a lie. But it's a lie that inmates have heard for so long and that they have normalized in such a way. Well, without something like regular religious practices, without going to NA, AA, without having a strong support network, without having something that prevents them from making that boneheaded decision to just dive face first into a bad lifestyle, well, it can be a constant fight, and a lot of guys fail at it. I have a good friend who I've communicated very little with. He got out before I did, and then reoffended. He got addicted to whatever drugs he happened to like. I believe it was meth in his case. And he went out and did some awful things. Unforgivable's a hard word, and he didn't, thankfully, hurt children. He didn't commit a crime of a sexual nature. That said, criminals commit crime, and almost universally, a crime hurts an innocent victim. Whenever you really start looking into what some of the things that people say they did whenever they were in prison, well, you take somebody who, all I did was I had a DUI. And it sounds like a small thing, a DUI, but he endangered himself and everybody on the road. He could have taken a life, an innocent life. The point of the tangent was that my friend, he did some pretty crummy things whenever he was out, and I haven't reached out to him as well as I should have. I wrote him once. I sent him a JPay message once, but it's hard to remember the way that drugs crawl inside of your mind and make things that you would never do, that aren't in your character, seem like a good choice, seem like an acceptable choice. I suppose you got to treat an addict whenever he's using like he's just a different person. Arthur D. asked, my story about sparring and grappling with Dragon made me think I had a judo or a wrestling background. Is that the case? I was in a lot of small fights whenever I was an adolescent. Nothing too major. I never hurt anybody. Nobody ever really hurt me. But around the time that I was 15, I decided I was going to learn to fight, and I had a friend who was 18 who had just finished boot camp and then dropped out of the Marines. He had made it to his last couple of days in boot and physically assaulted his drill instructor of all things. I asked him to teach me to fight, and he did a great job of it. It was about 3 months where he and I sparred every day. I could definitely handle myself at that time. Mind you, that was about 20 years of inactivity and a couple of serious injuries ago. Today, I wouldn't want to put my faith in my combat abilities. But around the time that I was arrested, absolutely, I felt like I could have handled myself. And I'm really proud of the fact that I served the entirety of my incarceration. I didn't hurt anybody. I wasn't hurt seriously. I got sucker punched a couple of times. I had a knife held on me pretty terrifyingly one time. I'll tell that story. I woke up to the guy, piece in hand, hands wrapped, coming at me. I came up out of bed, and my life could have ended right there. But with the couple of exceptions of times where there was no way to avoid it, I never did anything physically confrontational. Prison is an environment where violence is a coin that people understand. You have that piece of advice that you hear on TV whenever you get locked up. Find the biggest guy on the yard and touch him up. Just beat the heck out of him, and that way everybody knows you're not somebody to be messed with. It's the worst piece of advice I've ever heard. It's a cliche, and you hear it on TV, and I just pray nobody has ever really done it in prison. Because for starters, he's the biggest guy on the yard. He can probably beat you half to death. He didn't get that big by mistake. He cares. But even in addition to that, assuming that you win, all you've done is established yourself as somebody who's violent and erratic, who just picks fights with guys that might win. Unless you want to spend the rest of your term fighting every day, it's not a great way to start your time. But, as is so often the case with bad, funny advice, there is a little piece of truth there. That once you establish yourself as a man of violence, nobody wants to mess with you. You get in a fight and you and he kind of bat each other around a little bit. You get a bloody nose and he gets a black eye, and then at the end of the day, you're okay and you shake hands. You didn't tell anybody anything. What you told him was that, you can handle yourself, you're willing to fight. On the other hand, if somebody cuts in front of you in line and you take a nice heavy metal thing, a couple of D batteries maybe that you had in your pocket out, and you don't say a word, you just bang him in the back of the head. Well, yeah, you established yourself as a stinking psychopath and nobody's going to want to be your friend. But speaking as an outside observer, whenever that dude who did that comes out of the hole, I give him 15 feet of distance and I don't talk to him, because that level of violence that he might have killed somebody just on having his feelings hurt, that's terrifying. It's one way people do their time. You tell people, well, win, lose, or draw, I'm coming back a second time, a third time. You beat me up, and I'm going to lie bleeding on that ground until I get my guts back, and I'm going to come at you until I win. And then whenever you're down, it's not going to be pretty or polite. I'm going to step on your face until there's nothing left. I don't want to kill you, but I want to make a point. I've heard guys say things like that. And whether it's true or not, you absolutely establish yourself as somebody that shouldn't be messed with. Nobody wants to die in prison. Nobody wants to get crippled in prison. Most of the fights are either organizational. It's a riot or a melee where you must be involved, or else there's going to be consequences that are worse than the riot and melee. Or there are things that could have been avoided, but it's about posturing. It's about establishing who you are and what you're willing to tolerate. By choosing a path of nonviolence, insofar as he's able, and don't imagine that I told people, oh, I'll never fight, you treat me any old way you have to, and I'll just put up with it. You're just asking to be treated poorly if you do that. But if you choose a path of nonviolence, and insofar as you're able, don't hurt the people around you, don't act like you're the biggest, toughest, scariest guy in prison, nobody's gonna single you out and mess with you. There are 1,000 people on a yard. Imagining you've got 100 bullies and 100 people who are likely to be bullied, who are constitutionally unfit for prison. Perhaps they're passive, small, weak, scared. As long as you're not in either of those groups, you'll see very little physical violence outside of, holy cow! Arthur D just gave me my first super chat. That's $10. Hey, thank you. That's just the coolest thing ever. I'm gonna get myself a burger and I'm gonna spend $5 to Scooby. That's just the coolest thing ever. Thank you so much, Arthur. Glad to finally catch your live stream. Thanks for interacting with us. Impressed you managed to protect yourself without hurting others. Looking forward to more great content. Cool. I was saying that a choice of nonviolence or violence, you're putting yourself into a situation. Because those 800 guys who aren't, you have 1,000 guys on a yard, you have 100 bullies and 100 people who are likely to be bullied, they're stuck in that situation on both counts. The bullies are unlikely to change the way they see the world. They're used to using physical force, the threat of violence in a daily interaction. Maybe they're not even bad people. I'm using the word bully. But some of them that's the way that they see the world. Conversely, you have the other guys who are unable to create a front that they're not going to put up with it. who will actively say, you say, hey, little guy, what are you going to do if I take your sandwich? They go, well, gosh, sir, please don't take my sandwich. Oh, well, odds are you're going to get your sandwich taken. The 800 guys in the middle, they say, you take that sandwich, see what happens. Well, some of them might mean it, some of them don't. I was one of those guys who didn't. I would have said, take my sandwich and see what happens. And I'll tell you what would have happened is I would have let you have my sandwich. It's not worth dying over. But there's no reason that the guys in the middle are going to get singled out. The hardest part was the littler guys. They are getting singled out and they are getting picked on to some degree. At least on the SNY side, whether or not they were in for a crime of a sexual nature factored. There may be a lot of bullies walking around on a yard, but that's okay because at SADF E-Yard where I was, which had a lot of nasty rapists and pedophiles, and they kept to themselves. They didn't announce what they were in for. But if there's 200 nasty creeps like that on a yard, yeah, there's some guys that people know. You know who that guy is over there? That's Roy Norris. He's a serial killer. He murdered a dozen teenage girls. And that piece of garbage over there is Miley. He cut off a little boy's genitalia. These are guys I knew, and whenever a bully is looking for somebody to go brush up against and poke in the face and see what they do, well, at least on the SNY sides, suppose that is a victim of choice. I intend to do just another 5 minutes or so conversation. This was a half-hour live stream that I had scheduled. I don't believe I said that whenever I started today. But if anybody had a specific question, I know that I had somebody in the comments mention that their son had just received a life sentence and been sent to High Desert State Prison. High Desert's a pretty nasty place, but I am in correspondence with somebody who is there on B-Yard, and they told me that B-Yard is pretty laid back right now. It's an SNY yard, meaning it's for guys that have dropped out of the gangs for whatever reason. And at least that yard, the 270, level 4 is what it's called, seems to be pretty safe and stable. I don't know about C and D yard. They're probably nasty and rocking and rolling, and I wouldn't want to be there. But A yard at High Desert is a level 3 and pretty stable. I had somebody ask for some information about High Desert. That's what I've got right now, but I'm happy to extrapolate or give more information if anybody had a specific question. I intend, in my next couple of videos, to speak about the professor just a little bit more. I want to talk about that little chunk of time that I did. I was a clerk. I went to work every day. I saw the professor over in his area pretty regularly. Phil Spector, I ate breakfast with him most mornings, though not often dinner. He didn't like going to dinner. And eventually, I ended up losing my job due to a pretty entertaining set of circumstances where I'd managed to get past the inmate proofing on the computers there in the office, and in spite of the fact that I hadn't done any harm, any malfeasance, I hadn't hacked into anything, well, the fact that I had gotten past it was enough that the captain had me very specifically moved from my position. After that, I was a canteen clerk, and then eventually I ended up being moved to D-Yard with my friend Tool, and I've talked about that. They moved a couple of Jewish inmates over to the Delta Gymnasium, their SADF. In my next couple of videos, I'm going to give some more background information in this little 3-month time period working as a clerk and talking to the professor. And Sonar, my coworker, will be mentioned regularly. He was a funny guy. He and I would write parody songs a la Weird Al and leave them for the other because he worked in the mornings and I worked at night. So often at night I would write a song and then I would leave it on the desk and he'd get it in the morning and laugh. I recall the last one that I wrote before I ended up losing the job was Third Watch Program Clerks to the tune of the Addams Family. I don't recall it now, but I'm going to have to see if I can't remember it and do a little video of my singing along with it, because I remember it was very cute and clever. These are the type of things that inmates do to kill their time. You ask, what do you do in a 16-year prison sentence? 16 years? Do you know how many days that is? How many hours? Well, you do anything you can think of. Make little jokes, tell stories. I suppose that those skills that I developed while incarcerated, I'm now reusing as a free man, telling the stories about making up the stories. I will answer this last comment from Arthur D, and then I'm going to start wrapping this up. He says, I think in one of your stories you mentioned a cellie sucker punched you after you were looking out the cell and had reduced vision due to bright light. Why did he do that? He had been a single cell for about 6 years because he had a colostomy, or perhaps an ileostomy, I can't remember. But the administration had allowed him to be single cell because whenever he had to burp the colostomy bag, which that is where your feces go, and then you have to take it into a toilet. It's a surgical addition, which is common in prison after having been stabbed in the stomach so many times. Well, nobody wanted to live with him, so they allowed him to be single cell. Once I became SNY and he did too, the administration took his single cell chrono, and he had some serious emotional issues from day one. And he later admitted whenever I talked to him that he'd been trying to drive me out of the cell. The logic being that if I told the cops I couldn't live with him because he was such a piece of garbage, that then the next cellie he could do the same thing. And he could go back to being single cell, not having to have a cellie. I suppose if he'd hit me and I'd beaten him half to death, that also would have accomplished the same thing. If you have too many problems with your cellies, they can give you single cell status. The exact reason that he hit me on that occasion was that I had got down and used the restroom after he went to sleep, if you can believe this. It was after 10 p.m., and I'd been loud and woke him up, and so whenever I looked out the window and started making myself a top ramen soup, he decided that he wasn't going to put up with it anymore and cracked me in the face. I'll tell that story at some point. That was the cellie before the guy that I woke up with him trying to kill me. There was 2 in a row in a period of about 2 weeks, and man, it was a crummy 2 weeks for me. Not to complain. I always try and catch myself at about that. I am truly blessed in that I did as much time as I did. It wasn't bad. I had a lot of pleasant experiences, and the unpleasant ones, well, I think they made me a better man. And I've gotten out, and to look back at my time and go, oh, it was awful, I hate it, is so small-minded and small-sighted, short-sighted. I did my time, and thankfully, I got out, and I learned something between A and B, hopefully. Thanks, Shadow Pit, for welcoming me back, but this is me wrapping up my live stream. I want to thank everybody for viewing, and I sincerely hope to, yes, Glenda, next Tuesday at the same time, anybody that wants to weigh in on time or date, I'm going to go back to once a week, Tuesday at 5 p.m. PST. And, well, if there is a better time, or heck, even a more frequent time, anybody can weigh in, and I'm perfectly willing to accommodate my audience. All right, thanks, Arthur. Thanks, Glenda and Shadow and Celeste Girl and Caden M. Everybody have a lovely evening, and thank you for listening.